Welcome to the first Deadball Era author book talk. I'm Dan Levitt, the book review editor for the Inside Game, the journal of the Deadball Era committee, and I will be hosting tonight's discussion. We're lucky and excited to have as our guest tonight, Rick Huhn. Rick has written three critically acclaimed books centered on the Deadball Era, so perfect inaugural guest. He's done a biography of Eddie Collins, which he subtitled The Baseball Biography. He did a biography of George Sisler titled The Sizzler, George Sisler, Baseball's Forgotten Great, and then a really fun book on the controversial 1910 batting race, which is titled The Chalmers Race, Ty Cobb, Napoleon, Lajoie, and the controversial 1910 batting title that became a national obsession. He's also talked and written on the Black Sox scandal. We're glad to have all of you here tonight and look forward to a fun discussion with Rick. We should have time for a few questions at the end. Feel free to put questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll see how many we can get to. With that, Rick, glad to have you on board. Why don't you first tell us how you got interested in SABR?
Okay, first of all, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks, Dan, for making me a leadoff batter here for this new series. I joined SABR about 20 years ago. I was like a lot of other people. My hesitancy in joining SABR was that I was math challenged. I thought SABR was basically about the SABR metrics, like a lot of others, and so I didn't make the move. But then I started writing a book about George Sisler, and in combing through some of the articles and things, I began to notice that a lot of the people that wrote the articles, and these were more baseball history articles, were SABR members. So I thought, well, I better take a look at this and see what's available there. Maybe this is another channel for me. So that's really how I got started with SABR. So about 20 years ago, fell in love with it. When I first joined, there was a Deadball committee, and I was looking into the Deadball era at the time, and I thought to myself, anybody that's writing books about stars of the Deadball era and things like that, these people might also be better at math than I am, but they also enjoyed baseball history. So that's how I got started.
Well, it's interesting. I would think most people would have joined SABR before they decided they were going to be a writer. So why don't you talk about, especially about baseball. So why maybe talk a little about how you got started as a writer and what made you decide that you were going to write a book about George Sisler?
Well, I'd always wanted to be a writer. When I was in high school, I was very, of course, interested in sports. And I was the sports editor of my high school newspaper. So I thought maybe that's what I wanted to do. But somewhere along the line there, I veered off into law. And so I had a law career. I always had in the back of my mind, I wanted to write something about sports later in life. And I was very fortunate in that I had a friend who was a lawyer representing George Sisler Jr. George Sisler Jr., the oldest son of George Sisler. He was handling his estate planning, and George was thinking about his later years, George Jr., that is. And at one point told my friend that he was very sad that nobody had ever written a book about his father, who was, in his mind anyway, a rather well-known baseball player. So this was a sad thing. So my friend turned to me and said, you're always talking about writing about sports and talking about baseball and all that type of thing. And would you be interested in having lunch with George Jr. and I and discussing this? So I went to lunch, and honest to gosh, I was astounded that nobody had written a book about George Sisler. I was familiar with Sisler and a lot of the players of that era from an old game that I used to play. Some people still play it today. It's a spin game, all-star spin game, and guys like Sisler and Collins were always getting a lot of hits in the game for me. And so I was familiar with that. And so I sat down, I said, well, I know somebody's written a book. I'll just after lunch today, I'm going to go and see what I can find. This was about 2001, 2002. And so I did. I went home and I couldn't find a doggone thing about George Sisler because we didn't have maybe all the internet tools that we have nowadays. But sure enough, there was nothing that I could find. So I called him back and asked him if he'd be interested in working with me and trying to get something going. And so that's how I got into it. I started researching about George Sisler Sr. and working. I was very fortunate because the family was very involved. This was a family that very close-knit family. And there were still two of the sons were living and a daughter. And you'd be familiar. George Jr., just for some background, was the general manager of the Columbus Clippers. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and he was a longtime GM. He'd also been the president of the International League. He had played some ball. He was a college player at Colgate and played just a brief time in the minors, but didn't have a career there. And he was picked up by the Cardinals organization. So with that in mind, he introduced me to Dave Sisler, who many of you are probably familiar with, a bonus baby out of Princeton in the 50s. And also the one daughter, George Jr. and David's sister, Frances Drockelman. And these folks provided me with all kinds of information. So I was off and running as a newbie writer, getting an opportunity that maybe most people wouldn't have gotten, working with a really wonderful family. And Dick Sisler by then, who probably is the more famous of the sons, had passed away. So I really didn't have that opportunity, but that's how I got started writing about baseball.
Well, I have to ask you, just given that, and we'll get into maybe the book a little bit more, but how was it working with the family? I mean, was there anything that they didn't want you to publish or anything that they were unhappy with as you went along? Like, we don't want this story aired, or was it all pretty good?
I never got one iota of that. It helped that George Sr. was a pretty decent, straightforward guy. I couldn't find anything to write about scandalous. And if I had, I would have sat down with him and told him, I had to do that and explain why I couldn't present just their side of it. They never interfered at all. In fact, they presented me with a 14-page typewritten biography that George Sr. had written for the family in his later years, just going through how he got this place, that place, and about his career. And there were some stories and things like that. So I was fortunate to have a sort of a 14-page SABR bio project article to work with right from the start.
So I'm going to jump around a little bit here on you. How do you, so that's a very interesting sort of that for your first book, you had a little help from the family. Your other two books, I mean, I'm assuming from the Eddie Collins book and the Chalmers race that was a little bit more of true just research, or did you have help? I guess the question is, how have you gone about generally researching your Deadball books, and how has it differed between them?
Well, the Collins book, just for an example, I'd had good luck with Sisler, obviously, so I contacted the family first off. There were two grandsons, and they were hesitant to become involved. They knew their other grandfather much better, who happened to be Herb Pennock, a Hall of Fame pitcher who had married Eddie Collins Jr. And they were much closer on that side of the family. And Eddie died at age 63, so there's a chance that they really didn't get to know him. For whatever reasons, anyway, that's the reason they gave. And so I went about that in a different way. I actually did not have the family background on that, so I hired a genealogist, professional genealogist, to do some background work on that. And so that got me off and running as far as the family background. And then for all the books, you do the research, you use the tools that are available to all of us. And the basic is go to the newspapers. And back in the first book, the Sisler book, was 2004 is when it was published. So back in the early 2000s, I had to go to the microfilm. Today, somebody starting out would probably look at newspapers.com or ProQuest or something like that, but those were not in existence back then. But I have to tell you that it was a good way to get started, because I still depend on the microfilm for the Deadball Era, especially. Most of the cities had multiple newspapers back then, something we don't have today. And even today, many of those are not digitized. So my current project, I'm still using some of the microfilm. So what you do is you had interlibrary loan back then, and I was a steady customer of my local library for that. And you find, even with the digitization, you find in the microfilm, you get a context, a broader context for the for your research. And not only in that you're forced to kind of look at the headlines and some of the other stories going on, but when you get to the sports page, you see other articles that are related that might, with newspapers.com, you put in George Sisler, you're going to get anything that mentions George Sisler. But what if there was an article that day that didn't contain that name, but still described an incident on the field that would be important, that maybe later involved the subject? And you get that from the microfilm. You do not get that from the digitized version. Don't get me wrong, I love newspapers.com. I think we all do. But I do think it fosters a little bit of laziness sometimes for young writers, that it's all right there at their fingertips, and they're missing the boat on all this rich material written by some fantastic sports writers of the Deadball Era, early baseball.
So what is it? All three of your books have really focused on the Deadball Era. Is there something about the Deadball Era in particular that captivated you? Was it sort of just you got into George Sisler and you decided this is sort of an interesting time? What is it that you spent all your time on the Deadball Era?
I didn't start out thinking Deadball Era. I can tell you, I knew a little bit about it. I liked the players from it, as I mentioned earlier, and was familiar with the players and all. But as I got into it, I became fascinated by the difference in the game of that time, what some people call inside baseball, and today it's more called small ball, and is essentially looked down upon quite a bit. But I like the idea of stolen bases, bunts, sacrifices, double steals. To me, the most exciting thing I can imagine is seeing an inside the park home run. Yeah. Those drive me crazy. Somebody stealing home is unbelievable. And of course, I get very frustrated with the fact that many of the players today cannot sacrifice a player over to second, even when it's absolutely called for. So I was fascinated by that, but I also really fell in love with the whole time period. The fact that the ball players and the reporters would ride together on trains between cities, the stories of the card games, who got the upper bunks and who got the lower right. bunks. And I just became fascinated with that whole period of time. And also like the idea that the players were celebrities within their own neighborhood. I had an uncle that lived in Chicago who, when I was very young, told me all about how a member of what he called the scandalized Chicago White Sox team, which later I found out was the Black Sox, would come in and shop at the clothing store and where he worked, and he said this was something these people would come in, and you knew the ball players, and they knew the neighbors in the neighborhood, and the ballparks were part of the city scape. They were part of the landscape. So that's really what drew me there.
No, I'm with you. I mean, I think it's fascinating, just sort of the intimacy between the players and a little bit less of the whole professional and bureaucratic side of the baseball world at the time. Well, right. Let's just talk about your books, a little for a couple of minutes here.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about George Sisler and his biography, you started a little bit, but just any sort of couple of maybe George Sisler comments, stories on him.
Sure. I just want to go back a little bit and set the scene for Sisler, and please cut me off if I get going too long on this, because we got other things to cover. But the Sisler came from an educated family. His parents were teachers, and he grew up in Akron, Ohio. That also drew me towards him because I'm from Ohio. He was a pitching star in Akron, and then went on to the University of Michigan to become an engineer. He got a bachelor's in engineering. So he was that was his career setting when he really set out. But he became a pitching sensation in Akron, and that carried over to the University of Michigan, and he could also hit. So he wasn't a bad hitter. But it was pitching that really got him going. The University of Michigan was a powerhouse, and he was the star of the team. And his coach, his first early years at Michigan was Branch Rickey, somebody we're all familiar with. So he had the opportunity to hook up early on with Branch Rickey, and that became a lifetime relationship and friendship as the years went by. And so while he was still in Akron playing some summer ball, he was not yet of age. He signed a contract with the Pittsburgh Pirates, owned by Barney Dreyfuss. When he got to Michigan, Rickey found out about this, and he wasn't too happy about it. And Rickey had gone to law school and fashioned himself a lawyer. In fact, practiced law for a while. And so Rickey said, I'm going to go get a judge that I know that now practices law, an former judge, and we're going to see if he can get out of that. So they went to battle with Barney Dreyfuss and the Pirates, and they were able to make some headway there, and he sort of became a free agent again. Anyway, at the end, Rickey had moved on by then to the Browns, and when Sisler graduated, it became a battleground between the Pirates, who still laid claim to Sisler, and the Browns with Branch Rickey at the helm. And even though he got a better offer from the Pirates, loyalty was a big thing for George. He went with the Browns. He became a Browns pitcher to start off in 1915. And he stayed with the Browns for most of his career, but he only lasted as a pitcher for part of that first season, maybe a little bit on. And he was switched to first base. First of all, he was having some arm trouble. And then it was obvious that he was a better hitter than he was a pitcher for long-term purposes. So that's how he got his start. And then he was with the Browns up until 1927. So some of this went over beyond the Deadball era.
Sure.
But he was a prototypical, in my mind, Deadball player. Except for 1 year throughout his career, he had all the attributes of the Deadball era, and that he was a terrific bunter. He got a lot of hits. In 1920, he set a record that lasted for 80 years with 257 hits. The record was broken in 2004 by Ichiro, and of course, the record was broken about 2 months after my book came out. So immediately the book was a bit outdated as far as the hitting record. But he had those two wonderful years in 1920 and 1922. But during the Deadball era, he also did well. He hit in the upper 300s. He ended up being a 340 career hitter, but he had some issues after the 1922 season that set him back. I don't know if you want me to keep going with that.
No, we can.
No,
that's great. I mean,
anyway.
that's a teaser to get your book, and it's interesting too. I know that Dreyfuss that was one of the reasons he turned against the National Commission. And when that blew up after the governing body, and when that blew up after the the Black Sox scandal, and the commission blew up for a lot of other reasons too. He was certainly one who was pushing to do the commissioner. But so just on the Sisler book, so is there anything in particular that surprised you in the research or in writing the book that?
Well, yeah, I think the thing that surprised me actually is not a deadball issue, but I think it would be of interest is after his career was over in the early 1930s, Sisler went into partnership on a sporting goods store in St. Louis. And it was relatively successful, but in the early 1940s, his friend, now more friend than coach anymore, Branch Rickey, asked him if he would come with Branch when Branch went to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Branch Rickey had moved on from the Browns, of course, to the Cardinals, very successful there, and then took the Brooklyn Dodgers job. And he talked Sisler into coming out of retirement and sticking around the area and scouting for him, coming to spring training, helping out where he could with batting and things like that. And then in 1945, talked George into coming with him to Brooklyn on a permanent basis. George and his wife moved to Brooklyn. And what I found a real interest was that George became quite a batting instructor. And he had, while he was with the Dodgers, he was one of the people that scouted Jackie Robinson. Clyde Sukeforth, of course, was the main scout, but he had also sent out George to scout Robinson. And so when Jackie was signed and came to the Dodgers, George was assigned to help him learn the first base position, because Jackie'd been a shortstop type and an infielder, but not a first baseman. And in his previous baseball action, and he also helped him with hitting. And I was surprised at the comments and very flattering comments from Jackie Robinson about George. And along those same lines, I was surprised that he had helped out Duke Snyder. Snyder's comments were extremely flattering. Carl Furillo, a number of the Dodger players. And then he went on to Pittsburgh when Branch Rickey suddenly left the Dodgers. Won't get into that whole thing, but Rickey took over as a GM in Pittsburgh and brought Sisler with him. And over there, he worked with people like Dick Grote, who eventually became an MVP, won batting title. The comments were amazing from him, from Frank Thomas, who just passed away. He helped his batting, according to Thomas, and Roberto Clemente. Those were all surprises to me. I even knowing what I did know about him, I didn't know of his prowess as a batting instructor, and so I guess that surprised me about as much as anything.
No, that's fascinating. Well, let's move on to Eddie Collins a little bit, and maybe you have a vignette you want to share about Collins. Well,
I mentioned a little bit about knowing about Collins from my little spin game and all that stuff, but I also, when I was writing the Sisler book, I kept coming across items about Eddie Collins. And because of my interest in the Deadball Era, I was very interested in Collins, because Collins, a good part of his career was with during the Deadball Era. He started out in 1906, and he had a very long career. Some of my friends, including Steve Steinberg, some other people, always accuse me of taking on people with long careers. Well, Collins had one of the longest. He had a 25-year playing career. Anyway, so I found that he was really, even more so than Sisler, who did swing with some power. He was much more a prototypical dead ball player. And unlike Sisler, who never played in a World Series, Collins was on a number of World Series teams with the Athletics from 1910 to 1914. They were in the series 4 out of the 5 years. He was also in 2 World Series with the White Sox. Then he came back to the Athletics. He was hardly playing at that point, and was on their World Series teams in 29 and 30. So he was just the opposite as far as he was in the crossfires on a lot of the big events of those years, and played with for Connie Mack, and played in the $100,000 infield. And for those who don't remember, that was a pretty spectacular infield, and that's back when $100,000 was a heck of a lot of money. And so it was an impressive feat. And that was Home Run Baker was playing third base. Jack Berry was the shortstop. Collins, the second baseman, and a guy who deserves more publicity and better, Stuffy McInnis, was the first baseman. And so he played with some terrific players, and so it made for a book that was really rich in the Deadball era lore. And Collins was in the middle of all of it. Collins was had also been a great college player. In fact, a little known fact there, maybe I'm taken away if you want to know something that surprised me. Collins was actually the quarterback of Columbia University back in the day when Columbia, the Ivy League, was a big time football conference, and he was the backup his early years, and then became the quarterback to a fellow named Wild Bill Donovan. Now, this isn't Donovan that was the pitcher that we all know about, Wild Bill Donovan, but this was the fellow who later became what would have been the director of the CIA, the forerunner of the CIA, Donovan. He was the quarterback, and Collins, at 5'9", 140 or so pounds, was the quarterback on the Columbia team. And he actually made statements early on that he liked football a lot better than baseball. So anyway, but with Collins, you got not only the Athletics, but you were able then to get into the Chicago White Sox, and his time after the 1914 season when he went there. So he was in some of the more controversial World Series. He wasn't always a great player in the World Series, and if there's any criticism of Eddie Collins, it's that in 1914 and in 1919, the Black Sox World Series, he was not very good. But he also was the hero of the 1910 World Series and the 1913 World Series. So it was a book that gave me a lot to sink my teeth into.
You're right. You picked a guy there with a long career, both playing and then after as well. Well,
Right.
let's talk a little about your third book, the 1910 batting race, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. I mean, what a fascinating story. Just, sort of a couple of, vignette or two about that race and your interest in it.
Yeah, in keeping with my theme, my original plan was to write a biography of Napoleon Lajoie. That would have been good. I'm glad that David Fleitz wrote a book very shortly thereafter. I don't know if we would have covered the book at the same time or not, but he covered it really well. But I got sidetracked pretty early on by the batting race of 1910. I'm not sure if there's any one thing about the race itself, but I became fascinated with the idea that in 1910, there could be a automobile prize given for the batter in baseball who was considered the best player in baseball. And at that time, the person who would be considered the best player in baseball was the ball player with the highest batting average. Today, if you would say that, you'd have a lot of people hissing and booing at a SABR conference, because they would say, balderdash to that. How could this be? But back in the day, that is the batting average was the yardstick for the best player in baseball. And I also became fascinated by the fact that it was going to give me a kind of a cast of characters that you could make a motion picture out of if you were doing a baseball film. Again, the thing that surprised me the most is I thought it was going to be a batting race with all these different players like Hannes Wagner and just a big group of Tris Speaker and all these guys, but it came down very quickly to a two-man race. And it just so happened that the two were the young and the old in baseball. Napoleon Lajoie, 35 years old, had been the batting king of the American League, had I think 3 batting titles to his name. And then the young Turk, 23-year-old Ty Cobb, who already had won 3 batting titles and was on his way to many, many more. And they were contrasting styles of player. And so it gave me a lot to go on right off the bat with that. And then you kind of get to the end of the year, and you had at the start of the year a national commission that wasn't sure they wanted to do this, but they thought, well, we'd never had a batting race that was problematic. Well, this one came down to the last day of the season, and then to boot controversy, which actually was really upsetting to the powers that be, including Ban Johnson, in that the batting race was taking precedence over the World Series that was coming up in just a couple more weeks. Nobody was that interested in that. All the headlines were going because the batting race had been turned upside down by the allegations that that Lajoie had been gifted a bunch of bunts on a doubleheader the last day of the year. In fact, he went 8 for 8 with a sacrifice, and he and his teammates were upset about the fact that he hadn't been given a hit on that play. They thought he should be 9 of 9. So I'm short circuiting it all. There's a lot more to it, but it made for a fascinating start to the book, and then to find out years later on that actually the statistics were wrong, and somebody from SABR, one of the more famous SABR members known to all of us, Pete Palmer, had been going through the stacks doing his sabermetrics work, and had come upon the fact that that there was a huge error and maybe even a little conspiracy involved, in that the error only turned up on Ty Cobb's record sheet and had been corrected on all the record sheets of the Red Sox and the Tigers. So it went on, and I don't think it's ever been totally resolved today. I'm not sure that that all the record books, of course, Cobb is and rightfully so at this point, is the batting champ, but Baseball Reference, for example, has the Lajoie with a point over, I think he's 383 and Cobb's 382 at this point with all the corrections. So it allowed me to get into statistics and a little bit of sabermetrics on my part too.
So just before we go off of that story, was there anything there, any particular thing that you thought I mean, it's such a fascinating story that you learned in writing that story, or that surprised you?
Well, one thing that I learned is that at least as people interested in getting a correct baseball history, we never should stop researching and never stop looking and taking another look at those box scores as you're going through. You never know what you're going to find, and it might be a little nugget like Pete Palmer found and then turned it over to the Hall of Fame. Cliff Cackline and the Sporting News became involved and kind of turned things upside down. But it made me think, you know, when I'm doing my research, I should keep an eye out for just about anything and question it if it doesn't look or smell right.
Well, that's a nice transition sort of to sort of the last group of questions, Rick, that we were talking about here, back to some of your book writing. So, I mean, one of the things, I mean, your books have a really nice narrative flow. You make a nonfiction book, even though we all know how it ended, or a biography, we still want to read it. I mean, is there anything in particular that you concentrate on or that you do to try and make your nonfiction particularly readable?
Well, I'm a huge mystery spy reader, always have been. And I notice there's kind of one thing that they all have in common, and that is that they start out and catch you early in chapters, and they get to the substance and the meat. And at the end of the chapter, they kind of pick up and leave you a little bit hanging and wanting to turn that page. And so I like to write the kind of, or tried, I don't know how successfully, write the book that I like to read. And so that's how I've written it. So if you read my books, you usually notice that I might catch something at the start and then spin around and then talk about what went on in between. And then at the end, try to come up with something that makes you think, oh, maybe that isn't exactly what I thought it was. I better turn the page, see what the heck this guy's getting to here. So that's kind of how I tried to write.
And I think your books really read well. So I think you've been highly successful at that. A few more book writing. So how long does it typically take you to write a book?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. I guess if I had to break it down for the three, I would say a year of research. Although to tell you the truth, one thing I've always had trouble with, and I've talked to other people, is knowing when to quit, when you've really got enough and you want to start writing. So at some point you just have to start. But about a year of research, about a year of writing, and then when you have a publisher take a look at it till it gets back out, I'll go back and forth with everything, the editing and the proofs and all that stuff, about another year. So I'd say about 3 years. At least that's the way I was writing early on.
So did the process between the three, your book writing process differ? You talked a little bit about obviously how you had the family on the Sisler book, but aside from that, was the process fairly similar or did it differ? The last book, it sounds like you started with a Lajoie component and then you sort of broadened that. So maybe you can talk a little bit how the process might have differed between the books.
Well, some of it was just knowledge of what's out there, sources. Obviously, the first one I didn't know all the various sources that I did as the years went by. For example, the various archives where you could get books or photographs. Photographs are a big part of it for us that write about, particularly the Deadball Era. There's some terrific photographs. So I think I started finding more sources, archival material. Certainly the Hall of Fame is unbelievable, and I became more comfortable with working with them on books and things like that. So it was more finding more source materials for the. It was important, I thought, for the my last book on the Chalmers race to really delve into the newspaper coverage of 1910 in Detroit and St. Louis. And there were so many newspapers in St. Louis that I ended up finding through Steve Steinberg, finding a lady who did a terrific job of researching and getting me the materials. There were like 6, 7 newspapers in existence at that time. I could never have covered that in any time. I wouldn't have made it through my 1 year that I just told you about researching. I know that. And then I went up to Detroit and the Ernie Harwell collection up there and things like that. And so I just think the sources broadened, and then the internet, ProQuest had come along by then. I don't think newspapers.com had come along, but we had access through SABR to some of the ProQuest materials. So I was able to broaden the scope a little bit.
So maybe you've already covered this a little bit in your other comments, but what would you say is the most important lesson you've learned through your years of writing?
Well, that's a kind of that's a broad one. I think I covered it a little bit, but one thing is I do believe that you have in gathering the materials, you have to eventually realize that you're not going to have everything. That when the book comes out, as I mentioned, the Sisler book, obviously I was disappointed that I kind of missed the boat. I was fortunate that I did have some contact with some of the Japanese press on the Ichiro, so we got some publicity for the book through that. But that I realized that, you know, maybe I delayed a little bit. I could have had it, but you have to learn that there's a time to stop and a time to start writing, and I guess that's the lesson that I've taken with me.
No,
I haven't learned it very well.
I'm with you on that, right? I mean, because at some point, I mean, you write the book and then all of a sudden, you know, because of our community, which is great, somebody, you find out stuff that you didn't know when you were writing the book, and you just sort of got to realize it's going to turn out, that's going to happen.
Yeah. In fact, after the Chalmers book came out, somebody read the book and they were very complimentary, but they disclosed to me that they had found another at bat for Lajoie. So that the numbers that everybody's quoting are not, you know, just exactly right. So, you know, all you can do is take that in stride. And if you ever do an author's talk for SABR's Deadball committee, you reveal that out there somewhere, there's at least one more at bat for Lajoie. So that number is maybe not quite accurate even now.
So Rick, we're looking forward to more writings, additional books. What do your future projects include?
Well, I've completely decimated my one year plan. I've been working for a while on a biography of Billy Evans, a Hall of Fame umpire, certainly a part of the Deadball era, a close observer to many of the historic events of the Deadball era, and also a prolific writer. And that's been my problem, along with COVID, in trying to corral everything that this guy wrote. He was a former sports reporter and newspaper editor in Youngstown, and wrote articles for syndication at one point that were appearing in 600 newspapers. So think about putting in Billy Evans into newspapers.com and see what comes out, 30,000 hits. So anyway, I'm working on that. I finished the research and I'm in the early stages of writing about Billy Evans. And I think it's going to be interesting on a number of levels, but certainly the Deadball era is a major part of that.
Well, that's a great teaser. I mean, he did so many different things, is what makes that story fun too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as you were saying. All right, so we have a couple questions here. So Rick, thanks again for sharing that. And why don't I go through these questions? The first one from Paul Langendorfer. You mentioned that the Collins family was also related to Yankee great Herb Pennock and very much in love with this story. Since you have that connection, have you considered writing about Herb?
I haven't, although now maybe if I contacted the grandsons, they have to go along with me. But no, I haven't done that. Herb and Eddie were, I guess, best friends. At least my research indicated that. And somehow or other, through their connection, their children married. And they, as I said, they had the two grandsons. So maybe down the line, I don't know if I ever get through the Billy Evans book and I'm still standing up, who knows? Thanks, Paul, for the question, though.
Here's one from Mike Green. Do you think the media and or MLB would allow a player to sit out the end of the season to preserve his batting title lead, as Cobb did in 1910?
There'd be more pressure now, certainly with Twitter and all the internet. But that's an interesting story. I didn't really have time much to get into it, but it leads me to something I did want to mention and call your attention to. As Mike mentioned, Cobb left early, thinking he had the batting crown sealed up, and he took off in an automobile and drove east to take part in an all-star warm-up for the Philadelphia Athletics for the 1910 World Series. And I just noticed, I haven't read it yet, but there's an article in the latest research journal about that 1910 All-Star series that Cobb played in. Would they allow it today, Mike? I'm not sure. I really am not sure if he could get away with doing that. Certainly it would not come out good for his reputation moving forward.
Yeah. One more question here. Maybe there's be a couple more, but Eddie Collins, how did he handle the 1919 World Series scandal, and did it change from how he talked about it early on to later in life, how he talked about it?
That's a good question. And if I'd had time to talk about other things that surprised me, that was certainly one of them. Eddie, of course, was not implicated in any way in the scandal, but early on acted shocked and could not believe it. And I found many articles where he was talking about, here I was, an observer, and almost a participant in one of the darkest days in baseball history, and I had no idea it was going on. Then later on, I came across some articles, one in particular where he said, oh yeah, everybody knew about it. In fact, Joe Gideon had told me about it that a couple of weeks before the series that some of my players were dealing with gamblers and this was going to happen. So he was all over the board in what he said. And the only thing I can think of is he probably did have an inkling of what was coming. But when he saw how it was handled by the commissioner, how Landis handled his fellow teammates, he didn't even want to, especially Buck Weaver, in that even attending a meeting and knowing about it was enough for a permanent ban in baseball, that Eddie had wanted no part of saying he had any inkling at all that this was happening. So the story that he put out, and again, this is all speculation on my part, educated guesses maybe, but that he did not want to reveal that he had been tipped off that something was coming and it wasn't going to smell good during the series.
Right. We have one question here from Mary Luthner wanting to know who the Black Sox was that frequented the shop, your uncle's shop, if you can say.
Well, that is going to go down. I have no idea. You have to keep in mind, at the time he was telling me these stories, I was an early baseball fan. I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old, and I would ask him, "What now? Was that fella in the store again?" And I was more interested at the time that he even would know a former baseball player. That was unbelievable to me, but some stuck in my mind all those years about Scandal. And so when 8 Men came out, I was probably one of the first people in my neighborhood to run to the bookstore to get a copy of the book. Since then, of course, it's been discredited in some parts, but it still was a great read and a fun movie to watch. And it led then to an interest in the Black Sox, and so I've been involved with that, and it was one of the things that in writing the Eddie Collins book, I became friends with Gene Carney, who founded the Black Sox committee that has given all of us so much joy in participating and trying to unravel the mysteries of the Black Sox scandal.
Well, Rick, I think those were the questions, and had a lot of nice comments here in the chat. Really glad you joined us. This was just a lot of fun, and just love the passion you bring to the Deadball and all your books, and they're really fun to read. And so
Well,
looking
thank you,
forward
Dan,
to looking forward to the next one.
Okay, well, I hope we got this thing off on a good start, and everybody tonight will come back for more. I know I will.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Hopefully we'll see
Okay.
you at the next one.
Thank you.